Evelyn's heart pounded in her chest like the steady thrum of a distant drum, each beat a reminder of the past she had tried to forget. The canyon wind lashed at her face, tugging strands of her dark hair across her eyes and carrying with it the acrid scent of sagebrush, dust, and scorched earth. Below her, the town stretched in the fading glow of twilight ramshackle wooden buildings leaning precariously against each other, roofs warped from years of sun and rain, and streets muddied by the recent passing of wagons and horses. 1 year ago, she had been given to the Apache tribe to settle a debt her father owed, her body and future considered a bargaining chip. And now, after 12 months of exile and transformation, she stood at the edge of that same settlement, a stranger and a force all at once. Her dress, once carefully starched and pristine, now hung in muted earth tones, patched in places with leather and thread. Dust clung to the fabric, mingling with the sweat that traced rivulets down her back from the long journey. Her boots were scuffed, soles worn thin by endless riding along rocky trails, through forests, and across rivers. Yet, despite the wear, there was a confidence in her step, a quiet assertion that she had survived, and more than survived, she had grown stronger. Evelyn's eyes swept over the town below, noting the shuttered windows and the figures peeking out from behind doors. She could feel their gazes burning into her, curiosity laced with suspicion. They remembered the fragile girl they had sent away timid, obedient, and entirely under the control of her family's whims. But she was no longer that girl. The Apache had taught her patience, survival, and the silent language of power. And she had learned that strength was often quieter than fear, but far more commanding. A dry gust of wind swirled around her, tugging at her hair and carrying the faint tang of river water from the canyon below. She inhaled deeply, letting the scent of the land fill her senses. The river had been her constant companion for months, whispering secrets in its endless currents, and tonight its memory steeled her nerves. She could still hear its song in her mind, the rush of water over stone, the shimmer of moonlight dancing across the surface, the scent of wet earth and reeds. It had been the river that had taught her to trust herself, to listen to instincts honed by necessity rather than fear. As she descended the ridge, her boots kicking up small clouds of dust with each step, memories surfaced unbidden. She remembered the first night in the Apache camp, the warmth of the fire, the smoke curling into the sky, and the low hum of chanting in a language she had not understood. She had been watched, studied, and cared for in ways that surprised her. No one had touched her without permission. No one had assumed ownership of her body. It had been a foreign kind of respect, a protective reverence that she had never known existed. And in that unexpected kindness, she had discovered a piece of herself she did not know was missing, a courage that had grown quietly, like roots deep in the canyon soil. By the time she reached the main street, the townspeople had begun to gather, drawn by curiosity and an undeniable sense of scandal. The blacksmith paused mid-swing, hammer in hand, eyes wide as they tracked her approach. Children peeked around corners, whispering, their small voices carrying the weight of anticipation. Even Sheriff McAllister, a man known for his suspicion and narrow-minded judgments, stepped out from behind the saloon with his jaw tight, his gaze sharp and questioning. Evelyn's gaze swept over them all, and for the first time since she had been sent away, she felt a thrill not of fear, but of command. She was no longer at the mercy of their opinions. A year of living on the edges of civilization, guided by a tribe that valued honor and strength above all, had transformed her. Her hands rested lightly on her hips, her shoulders squared, and her eyes, dark and unwavering, told a story her lips did not yet need to speak. For a moment, time seemed to hang suspended, the wind frozen, the town held its collective breath. And then, with the quiet patience of someone who had waited an entire year to reclaim her life, Evelyn took a step forward, leaving the ridge behind and crossing into the world that had sent her away. She was no longer their possession. She was her own, and the reckoning of what that meant was only just beginning. The Apache camp sprawled along the river like a living tapestry, each tent and shelter perfectly positioned among the rocks and trees, blending with the earth rather than conquering it. Evelyn had arrived here a year ago, uncertain, frightened, and feeling like a fragile piece of driftwood tossed by circumstance. Now she moved through the camp with a quiet authority, her steps measured, her presence commanding respect without a single word. The smell of wood smoke, wet earth, and roasting venison filled the air, grounding her in a world that was harsh, yet honest and fair in ways her old life had never been. She had been given to the tribe under circumstances she still barely understood, a transaction to settle her father's debts. But the Apache had treated her with a reverence that startled her at first. No one had forced her. No one had crossed boundaries she was not ready to give. It had been a foreign kind of respect, one that valued honor, patience, and self-determination. Over the months, she had learned their ways, how to track animals across the plains, read the subtle language of the wind, and survive in a world where every step mattered. Evelyn remembered her first ride through the canyon trails. The horse beneath her had moved like liquid power, muscles coiling and releasing in perfect rhythm. She had gripped the leather reins with tentative fingers, hard hammering, and Tayan, her protector. An imposing Apache warrior with dark eyes and long black hair had guided her patiently. He had never rushed her, never demanded more than she could give. And over time, the fear she had carried from the town dissolved, replaced by a quiet confidence and a deep, unspoken trust. The camp had its rhythms. Dawn brought the smell of coffee brewed over open flames and bread baking in clay ovens. Midday was for training, hunting, or repairing tools and tents. Evenings were for storytelling, dancing, and music. The drumbeats echoing across the river and into the canyon, blending with the calls of birds returning to their nests. Evelyn had discovered a strange freedom in these routines, freedom she had never known in the structured world of her family or town. Here, she was seen as a person, not a possession, and her virginity, preserved out of respect rather than fear, became a symbol of the Apache code of honor, not a mark of shame. She often walked along the river, letting the current whisper secrets she could barely understand, yet somehow felt. The water shimmered under the moonlight, silver against the dark rock, and she remembered the night she had sat alone, letting the cool ripples lap at her boots while Tayan kept watch silently from the shadows. It had been a protective presence, steady and reassuring, a reminder that she was not entirely alone, even in her most uncertain moments. Evelyn's relationships in the camp had grown in subtle ways. Children would gather near her when she walked by, listening intently as she mimicked the movements of animals or shared stories she had learned from the tribe. The elders would nod respectfully, sometimes giving her small tokens of approval, a feather, a piece of polished stone, or a simple smile that carried far more weight than words. Even the warriors, who were formidable and intimidating, treated her differently, never with desire, always with deference and quiet admiration for the skills she had honed. And then there was Tayan, muscular, tall and imposing. He moved with the quiet assurance of a man deeply rooted in his world. His long black hair fell across his broad shoulders, and the tribal jewelry he wore shimmered in the sunlight, marking him as both protector and leader. He had been present the night she arrived, and he had remained ever since, silently guiding her, guarding her, and teaching her the unspoken codes of survival. Their bond had grown into something unshakable, a mixture of respect, trust, and an understanding that transcended words. Evelyn had changed in ways she could never have imagined. Her body was stronger, her mind sharper, her instincts honed like a blade against the rough edges of the frontier. She could ride through the canyon faster than most warriors, track deer or elk without leaving a trace, and navigate the wilderness with an unerring sense of direction. The timid girl who had been sent away was gone, replaced by someone who commanded attention simply by being present. Tonight, as she gazed across the river at the moonlight glinting on the water, Evelyn felt a deep sense of belonging she had never known before. This was her home now, not the town that had traded her like a commodity, not the dusty ridge she would soon revisit, but here, among the people who had shown her honor, patience, and the power of choice. And though she would soon return to that town, she knew she would never again be anyone's pawn. The river had always been a witness, a constant thread weaving through the fabric of Evelyn's new life. Tonight, under a canopy of stars, she walked along its bank, her boots sinking slightly into the damp earth as the water whispered against rocks and reeds. The cool air carried the scent of wet soil and pine, mingling with the faint smoke from distant campfires. Her reflection shimmered in the rippling surface, distorted by the gentle current, a ghost of the girl she had once been. A year ago, Evelyn would have feared the darkness, the isolation, the unknown. But now, she moved with the ease of someone attuned to the world around her. The Apache had taught her to read the land like a map, to listen to the wind, and to understand the language of water. Each rustle of leaves, each bird call, each ripple in the river was a message, and she had learned to decipher them with patience and attention. Tonight, the river seemed to speak directly to her, its currents carrying both memory and promise. She knelt and let her fingers trail through the icy water, watching the silvered reflection of moonlight twist around her hands. The touch of the river was grounding, calming, yet exhilarating. It reminded her of the nights she had first arrived at the camp, trembling, uncertain, and the nights she had spent learning to ride, to hunt, and to survive. Tayan had been there through it all, watching silently, guiding her, teaching her without ever forcing. A presence as steady and reliable as the river itself. Her thoughts drifted to the past, to the town that had sent her away. Faces blurred with memory, the smug glances of men who had thought her fragile, the whispers behind closed doors, her father's somber nod when she had been handed over. She had been given to the Apache, yet no one had expected what she had become, strong, self-assured, capable, and free in a way no one in that dusty settlement could understand. The sound of splashing water drew her gaze upward. A figure emerged from the shadows, a muscular, shirtless Apache warrior, Tayan, long black hair cascading over broad shoulders, tribal beads and leather straps catching the moonlight. He moved with silent authority, eyes dark and unwavering, his presence both protective and commanding. Evelyn smiled faintly, a gesture of recognition and trust. He had been her guardian, teacher, and companion for the year. Yet their bond transcended the simplicity of words. Tayan stopped a few paces behind her, the moonlight tracing the contours of his strong frame. "The river speaks tonight," he murmured in Apache, his voice low and steady. Evelyn nodded, feeling the same pulse of energy the water seemed to carry. There had been nights when she had doubted her place in the world, when fear clawed at her chest, yet Tayan had never faltered, never let her stumble alone. Together, they had navigated more than rivers and canyons. They had navigated the fragile terrain of trust, honor, and unspoken understanding. Evelyn traced the line of the river with her gaze, imagining the journey back to the town she had once called home. The thought stirred a mixture of anticipation and defiance. She was returning, but not as a timid girl, not as someone who could be bartered or dismissed. She carried with her the strength, knowledge, and resilience the Apache had nurtured. Her skills were honed, her instincts sharp, and her courage unwavering. She was no longer the same person who had been handed over a year ago. A cool breeze swept across the river, rippling the water and lifting strands of her hair. Tayan stepped closer, silent and patient, as always, a constant reminder that she had all eyes in the world, even when it seemed unforgiving. Evelyn took a deep breath, letting the scent of pine, river, and fire fill her lungs. Feeling the life she had built with the Apache flow through her veins, the night was quiet, save for the gentle rush of the river and the distant hoot of an owl. Evelyn stood tall, her shadow stretched along the water's edge, and allowed herself a moment of reflection. The girl who had arrived in the Apache camp trembling and uncertain was gone. In her place was a woman forged by wilderness, by patience, and by the quiet, steadfast strength of a warrior's world. Soon she would return to the town. Soon she would face the judgmental eyes and whispers. But tonight, standing beside Tayan, with the river murmuring its approval, Evelyn felt an unshakable certainty. She was no one's pawn, no one's possession, and her spirit untouched. Unbroken was hers alone. The river had witnessed her transformation, and the world beyond would soon see it too. The town smelled of dust, leather, and the faint tang of horses as Evelyn stepped onto the wooden boardwalk outside the trading post. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the buildings and streets, turning the weathered facades a deep amber. The townspeople had begun to notice her arrival even before she reached the square, drawn by the sound of her boots clacking against the worn boards. She could feel their eyes upon her, heavy with judgment, curiosity, and disbelief. The girl they had sent away a year ago was gone, replaced by someone entirely transformed. Evelyn kept her shoulders squared, her chin lifted, and her gaze steady as she entered the trading post. Inside, the smell of cured hides, dried meat, and candle smoke mingled in the warm air. Merchants paused mid-task, hand hovering over coins or goods, and the clatter of wooden tools fell silent. Evelyn's eyes swept across the room, taking in the familiar faces, men who had once laughed at her timid ways, women who had whispered behind her back, and children who stared wide-eyed at the stranger who was now undeniably herself. "Evelyn? Is that really you?" The voice cracked, uncertain, coming from Sheriff McAllister, who leaned against the counter with his jaw tight. His crooked gaze flicked to Tayan, who stood just behind her. The warrior's presence was unmistakable, muscular, shirtless, long black hair falling over broad shoulders, adorned with tribal beads and leather straps, his posture calm yet threatening, a living warning to anyone who might dare approach. McAllister swallowed hard, realizing that the girl he had once underestimated now walked not alone but with power. Evelyn allowed a faint, almost imperceptible smile to touch her lips. "It is me," she said, her voice low but steady, carrying the authority of someone who had endured more than most could imagine. She did not need to explain herself, not yet. The year with the Apache had taught her the value of patience, and she intended to make them understand that she was no longer the fragile pawn of their past. Assumptions. A few townspeople whispered to each other, their voices trembling between curiosity and fear. "She? She's still a virgin," one muttered under his breath, a statement meant to demean, but Evelyn caught it with calm clarity. The word hung in the air, and she realized with satisfaction that her past, once a source of shame and judgment, had become a symbol of her resilience. She had not been claimed, forced, or broken. She had been protected, nurtured, and allowed to grow in ways the town could scarcely comprehend. Tayan's eyes swept the room, scanning every face with a quiet intensity. Even the bravest of men felt a jolt of unease under his gaze. No one dared step closer, no one dared speak without caution. His presence alone shifted the balance, reminding them that Evelyn was no longer vulnerable, and that she was never alone. Evelyn stepped further into the center of the trading post, allowing the sunlight streaming through the windows to fall across her face. Dust motes danced in the golden light, creating an almost ethereal aura around her. She felt the weight of the year lift with every step, the fear, the uncertainty, the sense of being someone else's property. It was gone, replaced by confidence and a quiet command that demanded respect. Children peered around the edges of the room, curious but not frightened. They sensed something different about Evelyn, something powerful yet approachable, a strength tempered by the knowledge of survival and honor. The elders in the corner nodded subtly, recognizing that she carried the teachings of a people who valued respect, courage, and wisdom above all else. A merchant, tall and wiry, finally broke the silence. "You've changed," he said, his voice a mixture of awe and disbelief. Evelyn tilted her head slightly, acknowledging him without condescension. "I have learned," she replied simply. The words were soft, but every ear in the room caught them, echoing with unspoken authority. Outside, the sun dipped further behind the hills, casting long shadows over the trading post. Evelyn could feel the tension in the town, a mixture of shock, envy, and unease. But for the first time in her life, she did not care about their opinions. She had survived, grown, and returned stronger than anyone could have imagined. And with Tayan silently guarding her side, she knew that she could face anything, the whispers, the stares, and the judgments, and emerge unbroken dot as she stepped back onto the boardwalk. The townspeople parted instinctively, creating a path for her passage. The year had changed her, but it had also changed them. The girl they had sent away was no more, and in her place stood a woman forged by courage, honor, and the steady, watchful presence of the Apache warrior at her back. The encounter at the trading post was only the beginning, a prelude to the reckoning that was yet to come. The town smelled of dust, leather, and the faint tang of horses as Evelyn stepped onto the wooden boardwalk outside the trading post. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the buildings and streets, turning the weathered facades a deep amber. The townspeople had begun to notice her arrival even before she reached the square, drawn by the sound of her boots clacking against the worn boards. She could feel their eyes upon her, heavy with judgment, curiosity, and disbelief. The girl they had sent away a year ago was gone, replaced by someone entirely transformed. Evelyn kept her shoulders squared, her chin lifted, and her gaze steady as she entered the trading post. Inside, the smell of cured hides, dried meat, and candle smoke mingled in the warm air. Merchants paused mid-task, hand hovering over coins or goods, and the clatter of wooden tools fell silent. Evelyn's eyes swept across the room, taking in the familiar faces, men who had once laughed at her timid ways, women who had whispered behind her back, and children who stared wide-eyed at the stranger who was now undeniably herself. "Evelyn? Is that really you?" The voice cracked, uncertain, coming from Sheriff McAllister, who leaned against the counter with his jaw tight. His crooked gaze flicked to Tayan, who stood just behind her. The warrior's presence was unmistakable, muscular, shirtless, long black hair falling over broad shoulders, adorned with tribal beads and leather straps, his posture calm yet threatening, a living warning to anyone who might dare approach. McAllister swallowed hard, realizing that the girl he had once underestimated now walked not alone but with power. Evelyn allowed a faint, almost imperceptible smile to touch her lips. "It is me," she said, her voice low but steady, carrying the authority of someone who had endured more than most could imagine. She did not need to explain herself, not yet. The year with the Apache had taught her the value of patience, and she intended to make them understand that she was no longer the fragile pawn of their past. Assumptions. A few townspeople whispered to each other, their voices trembling between curiosity and fear. "She? She's still a virgin," one muttered under his breath, a statement meant to demean, but Evelyn caught it with calm clarity. The word hung in the air, and she realized with satisfaction that her past, once a source of shame and judgment, had become a symbol of her resilience. She had not been claimed, forced, or broken. She had been protected, nurtured, and allowed to grow in ways the town could scarcely comprehend. Tayan's eyes swept the room, scanning every face with a quiet intensity. Even the bravest of men felt a jolt of unease under his gaze. No one dared step closer, no one dared speak without caution. His presence alone shifted the balance, reminding them that Evelyn was no longer vulnerable, and that she was never alone. Evelyn stepped further into the center of the trading post, allowing the sunlight streaming through the windows to fall across her face. Dust motes danced in the golden light, creating an almost ethereal aura around her. She felt the weight of the year lift with every step, the fear, the uncertainty, the sense of being someone else's property. It was gone, replaced by confidence and a quiet command that demanded respect. Children peered around the edges of the room, curious but not frightened. They sensed something different about Evelyn, something powerful yet approachable, a strength tempered by the knowledge of survival and honor. The elders in the corner nodded subtly, recognizing that she carried the teachings of a people who valued respect, courage, and wisdom above all else. A merchant, tall and wiry, finally broke the silence. "You've changed," he said, his voice a mixture of awe and disbelief. Evelyn tilted her head slightly, acknowledging him without condescension. "I have learned," she replied simply. The words were soft, but every ear in the room caught them, echoing with unspoken authority. Outside, the sun dipped further behind the hills, casting long shadows over the trading post. Evelyn could feel the tension in the town, a mixture of shock, envy, and unease. But for the first time in her life, she did not care about their opinions. She had survived, grown, and returned stronger than anyone could have imagined. And with Tayan silently guarding her side, she knew that she could face anything, the whispers, the stares, and the judgments, and emerge unbroken dot as she stepped back onto the boardwalk. The townspeople parted instinctively, creating a path for her passage. The year had changed her, but it had also changed them. The girl they had sent away was no more, and in her place stood a woman forged by courage, honor, and the steady, watchful presence of the Apache warrior at her back. The encounter at the trading post was only the beginning, a prelude to the reckoning that was yet to come. The morning sun spilled over the town like molten gold, catching the rough edges of the wooden buildings and glinting off the dusty streets. Evelyn stood at the center of the main square, boots planted firmly on the ground, her long dark hair falling in controlled waves around her shoulders. She had not come to plead, explain, or seek forgiveness. She had come to be seen as she had become, unbroken, strong, and undeniably herself. Behind her, Tayan, the muscular Apache warrior, stood shirtless, long black hair framing his intense features, tribal beads and leather straps glinting in the sunlight. His presence was a living testament to the wilderness that had shaped her, a silent warning to anyone who might challenge the woman standing before them. The town had gathered quickly, curiosity, gossip, and disbelief pulling people from their homes like moths to a flame. Even the most confident men hesitated, sensing that today's encounter would change everything. Evelyn raised her chin and let her eyes sweep over the crowd. Faces that had once judged, whispered, or mocked her now stared with wide-eyed astonishment. She remembered their sneers, the way they had assumed she would be broken, submissive, and entirely defined by the choices of others. But she had survived the wilderness, the Apache's rigorous teachings, and the isolation that had once terrified her. She had become more than anyone in this town could comprehend. A man at the edge of the crowd tried to interrupt. We gave you away." "What right?" Evelyn held up her hand, cutting him off with an effortless authority. "I was given away," she said, voice carrying clearly across the square, "but not for you to claim me. I survived. I learned. I became stronger than you ever imagined. And I am not what you thought I would be." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some exchanged uneasy glances. Others whispered under their breath, unsure if the words applied to them or the girl they had once known. They had imagined a timid, obedient woman returning someone they could control or judge. Instead, they were met with confidence forged in the crucible of survival and honor. Taeyeon shifted slightly behind her, silent and steady, letting his presence reinforce her words. Muscles taut and defined, chest bare to the sun, beads and feathers catching the light, he embodied the strength and discipline that had nurtured Evelyn's transformation. The townspeople sensed immediately that she was no longer alone, that any attempt to intimidate her would be met with formidable resistance. Evelyn's gaze softened only slightly as she addressed the women in the crowd, those who had once whispered cruelly and now watched in disbelief. I was protected, respected, and allowed to grow. I was given lessons that none of you imagined I could learn. Her voice carried no accusation, only truth. And that truth resonated like a bell across the silent square. Children peered curiously from behind their parents, sensing something different. This was not the girl they remembered. She moved with a grace and quiet authority that commanded attention without demanding it. Her eyes, dark and unwavering, radiated strength, patience, and an unspoken defiance. An elder, leaning on a carved walking stick, nodded slowly. His eyes, sharp and discerning, recognized the change instantly. She has learned, he murmured, almost to himself. She has become one with what we have only whispered about. His approval, subtle but unmistakable, gave weight to Evelyn's presence and bolstered the undeniable truth she embodied. Even Sheriff McAllister, ever skeptical and narrow-eyed, felt the shift in the town's energy. He had expected to see a woman bound by fear and years of subjugation. Instead, he saw a force of nature, a woman who had survived, grown, and returned with the silent power of someone who could not be undone. Evelyn lowered her gaze briefly to the dusty ground, then raised it again, meeting every pair of eyes in the crowd with unflinching calm. I am not your pawn. I am not your property. I am myself, and I owe nothing to the expectations of a world that once sought to define me. Taeyeon's hand brushed hers lightly, a gesture that was neither possessive nor protective, but an acknowledgement of trust and shared strength. Together, they formed a silent, unbreakable alliance, a living embodiment of resilience, honor, and defiance. The square fell into a tense, electric silence. The town had witnessed not a confrontation, but a revelation. Evelyn's return, her survival, and the strength she now carried were impossible to ignore. They could stare, they could whisper, they could speculate, but they could not undo what had already been forged in the wilderness, in the Apache camp, and in the quiet, patient heart of a woman who had learned to claim her own destiny. And in that moment, standing with Taeyeon at her side, Evelyn felt the full power of her transformation, the knowledge that she was no longer defined by fear, judgment, or the choices of others. She had become a force that could not be denied, and the shock reverberated through every person who dared to witness it. By mid-afternoon, the town square had transformed into a tense theater of whispers and wide-eyed stares. Word of Evelyn's return spread quickly, carried by those who had glimpsed her in the morning and now shouted across streets and alleyways. She stood at the center, boots planted firmly on the dusty ground, hair glinting under the sun, eyes dark and steady. She no longer flinched at judgment, no longer weighed herself against the shallow expectations of the people who had once sent her away. Behind her, Taeyeon, the muscular Apache warrior, stood as immovable as a cliff, chest bare, muscles taut, long black hair blowing in the light breeze. His tribal jewelry, beads, feathers, and leather straps caught the sunlight, shimmering faintly as he scanned the crowd with quiet intensity. Each of his movements spoke of protection, strength, and an unspoken bond with Evelyn. Anyone foolish enough to challenge her would have to face him first. And that knowledge alone sent ripples of unease through the townspeople. Sheriff McAllister stepped forward, forcing his composure as best he could. His voice, when it emerged, trembled slightly with uncertainty. "Evelyn, you've returned." You've assumed much about me," Evelyn interrupted, her voice calm yet cutting through the murmurs of the crowd like a knife. "A year ago, I was given away. But I was not broken. I was not claimed. I was allowed to grow, to learn, to become strong. I am not the girl you remember. I am Evelyn." A ripple of gasps passed through the townspeople. Mothers clutched children to their sides, men shifted uneasily, and even the boldest of skeptics swallowed hard. She had returned not as a victim, not as a pawn, but as a woman who embodied resilience and unshakable confidence. A man with a rugged hat, clearly one who had mocked her in the past, finally spoke. "And what do you want from us?" His words, though intended to challenge, trembled with the uncertainty he felt. Evelyn's gaze swept over him, steady and unyielding. "I want nothing from you," she said. "I want recognition. Recognition that I am not to be judged by the past, nor by the shallow expectations of this town. I am myself. That is all you need to understand." Tayan stepped forward slightly, the morning sun highlighting the contours of his muscular frame. He did not need to speak. His presence alone reinforced every word Evelyn had said. The whispers turned into silence, the crowd shrinking back instinctively, sensing that this was no ordinary woman's return. This was a reckoning. The elders of the town, long observers of its social currents, began nodding slowly, murmuring in acknowledgement. They sensed the truth in Evelyn's stance, the undeniable reality that she had survived, thrived, and returned empowered. Even Sheriff McAllister lowered his gaze briefly, a mix of respect and resignation evident in his expression. Evelyn exhaled slowly, letting the tension in the square settle into a quiet acceptance. This was the moment she had been preparing for, the culmination of a year spent learning not only to survive but to claim her identity fully. She had returned to the town that had tried to define her, only to find that she now defined herself, and the world around her could not dispute it. Tayan's hand brushed hers lightly, a gesture of solidarity, reassurance, and shared triumph. It was neither possessive nor intrusive, but a reminder that she was never truly alone. Together they had navigated fear, judgment, and isolation, and together they had emerged unbroken, one by one. The townspeople began to disperse, some muttering in awe, others nodding quietly in grudging respect. The square, once a place of whispers and doubt, now held the echo of transformation. Evelyn remained for a moment, allowing herself a small smile, a silent acknowledgement of her own strength. As she and Tayan turned to leave the square, the wind picked up, carrying the scent of sage, dust, and freedom. She glanced back once, not with longing, but with quiet satisfaction. The town had seen her as she truly was, and nothing would ever diminish the woman she had become. The journey had begun with fear, uncertainty, and the weight of others' expectations. It ended with strength, honor, and self-determination. Evelyn had returned a survivor, and she would leave a legend. With Tayan at her side, muscular, shirtless, and unwavering. Adorned in his tribal jewelry, they walked toward the horizon, leaving behind the dusty streets and whispered judgments, carrying with them the undeniable proof that 1 year had transformed her entirely, and that she would never be anyone's pawn again.